Welcome, weary traveler, to a quiet journey through ancient Japan, where whispers of resilience echo through time, guiding you gently towards the tranquility of slumber. You were 12 when the silence became your truest language, a world before the sacred smoke blurred the edges of sorrow. They whispered that true devotion had no need for a voice, and so your own became the first offering you made. At dawn, the mountain mist still clung to the ancient stone steps like forgotten hands, a cold embrace that seeped into your lungs, yet it was not as chilling as the floor where you knelt. You could no longer recall the exact reason for your arrival here. Perhaps a whisper of famine, or the heavy burden of debts spoken in hushed tones within dark kitchens. You only remembered your mother's averted gaze and your father's strained words of opportunity, a phrase that choked with unspoken regret. Then came the monk, a figure who never asked for your name, instead measuring your arms, your cheekbones, and, most profoundly, your silence.
Now you find yourself draped in silk robes, a fabric far too fine for your tender age, your head shorn into the stylized crescent of a chigo, a temple boy. These robes serve as a mark of your chosen status, a symbol, they say, of holiness. Yet this sanctity feels more like being confined within a velvet cage. Behind the great, shimmering golden Buddha, other boys move with the quiet grace of ghosts, older and seemingly wiser in the intricate ways of navigating this secluded world within walls. Their eyes might briefly flicker with a knowing recognition, but they never linger. For the unspoken rule here is simple and absolute. Do not observe too much. Do not listen to what should remain unheard, and never speak unless directly addressed. Even then, each syllable must be weighed with utmost care, as if your very tongue might cost you a day's worth of precious food. The thick, sweet incense burns incessantly, as if attempting to conceal something more profound than the rot of ancient floorboards or the pervasive mildew of the mountain air. It strives in vain to mask the omnipresent scent of fear that you carry with you like a second skin, a garment you wear more naturally than the silk itself. They told you enlightenment is born of discipline, that suffering paves the path, and that your master, your new though, is both your guide and your gatekeeper. Yet when his hand lingers too long on your shoulder, when the evening prayers stretch endlessly into the night, you begin to grasp a different, unsettling truth. The path to heaven for you is paved with your silent consent. And consent here is just another word for that very silence.
You are not alone in this silence, for this pattern is not new. Centuries before your own voice began to crack, countless others knelt precisely where you do now, and they too were told to be eternally grateful. In the elegant imperial court of Heian, Japan, beauty was the very essence of order, found in a perfectly crafted line of poetry, a delicate brushstroke, or the serene countenance of a young boy. From the 9th century onward, Buddhist temples transcended their role as mere spiritual sanctuaries, evolving into powerful repositories of both status and unspoken desire. The Chigo system, never formally announced with fanfare, crept in like relentless ivory,
threading its tendrils through the ancient stone walls until no one could recall what the temple had looked like before its pervasive embrace. While Chigo were indeed temple acolytes, lighting candles, memorizing sutras, and mastering the art of vowing without offending the gods, beneath this surface, beneath the rhetoric of mentorship and piety, a darker truth festered. They were acquired, not willingly admitted, chosen not for their discipline or fervent devotion, but rather for their youthful beauty, their delicate frames, their smooth, unblemished skin, and their absolute, unyielding obedience. There were rituals, of course, for the Buddhists were masters of such intricate ceremonies. A Chigo would be formally assigned to a monk, a Nudo as a spiritual companion, publicly framed as a noble, even poetic exchange of wisdom and purity between generations, a living metaphor for a path to enlightenment. Yet privately this was nothing less than the systemic institutionalization of a profound and hidden abuse.
The transformation of a Chigo begins with unsettling swiftness. On your first day, they strip you of your given name, replacing it with a monastic one, something soft, something easily forgotten, a quiet erasure of your former self. Day 2 tests the very limits of your newfound obedience. Rise precisely at 4, carry the heavy robes, draw bath water warmed to just the right temperature for your master, and meticulously lay out his prayer beads, his lacquered comb, his precious writing brush. Should you fail even once, you will be swiftly corrected. Fail twice, and you will be made a chilling example for all to witness. By day 3, the touch of your master begins to linger, a fraction longer than it did the day before, an unsettling presence that grows with each passing hour. He praises your remarkable stillness, your profound silence, teaching you that to survive in this cloistered world is to become a perfect mirror, reflecting only what they desire to see, and nothing more of your true self. Other boys, through their subtle actions, indirectly teach you the unwritten rules. You observe the way they instinctively flinch when certain monks pass by. You note who walks with a telltale limp that was absent last season. And late at night you hear the muffled cries behind the thin paper walls, knowing instinctively that you must never dare to name them aloud.
And the boys themselves, not all, but enough, begin to internalize this twisted reality, some even starting to compete for favor, for protection, for the mere illusion of choice within their confined world. They meticulously memorize the monk's unpredictable moods, anticipating his every touch, preening before offerings as if praise itself were their only sustenance. In a world where silence has become synonymous with safety, some boys instinctively choose performance, embracing their roles with a practiced grace, and who could truly blame them for this desperate adaptation? Even submission, when perceived as a choice, can momentarily feel like a form of power, a fleeting control over their own fate. Yet, eventually that fragile illusion shatters, and it ceases to feel like power at all. You, too, will eventually age out of this aberrant system. At 14, perhaps 15, your voice will deepen, your face will sharpen, and the once fitting silk robes will no longer sit correctly on your changing frame. Some monks, seeing your transformation, will simply lose interest, turning their gaze to newer, younger faces. Others, however, will not, their desires remaining disturbingly fixed despite your growth.
You are given a new, less fine robe and a new undefined role, perhaps that of a copyist or a kitchen helper, or even nothing at all, simply a discarded presence. Some boys manage to leave the temple, but where would they truly go? Their families, long since having repaid a debt or lifted a burden, have erased them from memory, and the world outside holds no place for a boy who knows only how to kneel and serve. A few are taken by samurai, who often prefer their boys strong and silent, fitting them into a different kind of ridded structure. Others drift toward the bustling cities where kagema houses promise a meager coin in exchange for what they have already irrevocably lost. And then some, like you, choose to stay within the familiar confines, not because there is any genuine desire to remain, but because staying, paradoxically, feels infinitely safer than the terrifying prospect of remembering how to want anything at all. A quiet surrender to the known and the controlled.
They once claimed the warrior's path was inherently nobler than the priest's, a life of honor and martial prowess. Yet you soon discover that the grand corridors of a samurai household are no warmer than the austere temple stone, and the intricate rules governing your existence are just as sharp, just as unforgiving. The boy who departs the temple, with its broken rituals still clinging to his very skin, often finds himself in yet another kind of hall, this time surrounded by the glint of blades instead of the soothing chime of bells, by fierce war chants instead of chants of compassion. But the pervasive silence remains eerily the same. The rigid hierarchy is unchanged, and the dissecting gaze of the master, scrutinizing your every move, is disturbingly familiar. Here, they do not call you Chigo. Instead, you are now known as Wakashu, a name meant to imply apprentice, youthful heir, or even a future warrior, a title laden with deceptive promise. However, the old and insidious pattern quickly repeats itself. The contract is signed, the ceremonial words are spoken, and beneath the elegant brushstrokes lies the stark, unspoken truth. Your body belongs entirely to the one who now holds your training sword, a new form of ownership.
In theory, your purpose here is to meticulously learn Bushido, the revered way of the warrior, encompassing swordsmanship, intricate tactics, and unwavering discipline. In practice, however, you quickly learn to pour sake with hands that tremble subtly, to bow at the exact imperceptible right angle, and to present yourself as both dutiful son and subservient servant, a complex duality. You learn the intimate rhythms of the master's breathing late at night, especially when he returns from battle, half drunk, his robes caked in the dried blood of men and the ashes of burning villages. It is precisely at these moments that he seeks comfort, and you, without question, are expected to provide it. In the beginning, the samurai frame their desires with less elaborate ceremony than the monks. They are, after all, men of action, and they do not hide behind the veil of Sanskrit. Yet they are poets in their own unique way, calling their demands the sharing of loyalty, the strengthening of bonds, or even the purity of boy and blade. phrases that sound deceptively beautiful in the old revered texts. The ancient scrolls speak of a noble love between warrior and protégé, of great generals served by bright-eyed boys in their youth, upholding ideals of discipline, closeness, and oneness in body and spirit. But you understand the true meaning when the door is barred from the inside, when a man praises your discipline with a hand around your throat, knowing he speaks not of battle drills, but of something far more sinister and personal.
The training here is relentlessly brutal. You run until your legs buckle beneath you. You spar until bruises bloom across your ribs like the dark flowers of surrender, and you recite the ancient code of the warrior in a voice made hoarse from enforced silence. Yet none of this arduous effort truly earns you respect in the eyes of your master. What truly earns you favor is endurance, not on the battlefield, but in the chilling privacy of his chambers. It is the one who bears pain without ever crying out, the one who does not flinch when stripped bare in front of guests, the one who manages a small, grateful smile when asked if he is grateful. These are the boys praised as promising, marked for a continued, unsettling existence. Sometimes you are even lent to another samurai for an evening, a cold gesture of goodwill, a seal on an alliance, a human token exchanged between powerful men. You are expected to return quietly, with no visible damage, for if you return broken or shamed, you have brought dishonor upon your master. And yet, through it all, you endure, for the alternative is oblivion, a terrifying void, and you no longer know who you are without the constant possessive gaze of someone who claims to own you entirely.
Some of the boys, tragically, do not survive this relentless ordeal. You find them sometimes hidden away in the quiet bathhouse or deep within the secluded woods, hanging or cut open, empty bottles lying beside their lifeless forms, their eyes empty of all light. You know instinctively that you must never dare to cry, for a dead wakashu is considered a shameful thing, a mere defect, a story to be buried and forgotten. But still you remember them vividly, the quiet hum they would sometimes make at night, the way they once joked about escaping to the vibrant city of Kyoto, the way they would flinch even when praised, like animals anticipating the inevitable blow that always seemed to follow kindness. You remember them because they are mirrors, reflecting a part of yourself, and if you were to forget them, you would surely forget who you truly are. Then comes the inevitable shift. Your shoulders broaden, your voice deepens, and your master's possessive hand begins to linger less frequently as he takes a new, younger boy into his care. You are then presented with a choice, or what passes for one: stay and become a samurai yourself, now with your own wakasu to command, or leave and face the terrifying certainty of starvation, or something far worse, a return to a temple that has long since forgotten your very name.
Most choose to stay within the familiar, albeit painful, confines, telling themselves with a fragile hope that they will be different, that they will not inflict upon others what was so cruelly done to them. But the body, in its profound and unsettling wisdom, remembers everything. The rituals return like muscle memory, deeply ingrained. And as a new boy kneels before you, something within your own spine instinctively straightens, a chilling echo of your past. You begin to speak the very words you once heard, words you intensely hated, and you find, to your growing horror, that they sound disturbingly natural when they issue from your own mouth. This is precisely how the cycle continues, not through overt malice or conscious cruelty, but through the insidious power of mimicry, a learned behavior passed down through generations of trauma. Trauma in this world becomes a deeply embedded tradition, and pain itself transforms into a perverse form of pedagogy, a lesson silently taught and learned. And so the temple bells continue to ring on, marking not just the passage of time, but the relentless, unbroken rhythm of this enduring, tragic cycle. Later, when you are much older, when your own Mokashu has matured beyond your interest, and you begin to feel the chilling touch of your own mortality, you may find yourself wandering the bustling streets of Edo.
The temples are now a distant memory. The fierce war drums have quieted, yet the vibrant pleasure quarters of Edo beckon with their own unique allure. And there, amidst the flickering lanterns and hushed whispers, you see them again, but not as monks or as warriors, rather as mere commodities, painted, perfumed, and displayed behind delicate screens like exquisite dolls, the Kagema boys. You instantly recognize the familial gaze they wear, that unsettling blend of trained obedience and meticulously practiced charm, and in their eyes you see a haunting reflection of your younger self. Yet you deliberately walk past, because genuine recognition would demand an unbearable responsibility, and you have learned through bitter experience to survive by the painful act of forgetting. But some nights, late when the sake has blurred the edges of your shame, you will find yourself inexorably drawn to their doors, and you will pay, not for pleasure, but to remember, or perhaps to finally forget, whichever exacts the higher, more agonizing cost. In Edo, desire itself became meticulously regulated. What the temples once sanctified in the shadows and the samurai enforced through the cold steel of their blades, the shrewd merchants now openly sold in broad daylight, complete with precise price tags within velvet-draped parlors. The Kagema houses, often referred to as shadow tea houses, offered not merely the fleeting illusion of affection, but a perfected architecture of control, masterfully refined through the relentless pursuit of commerce.
Here, boys were no longer apprentices or acolytes. They were transformed into actors, into shadows, into ghosts for rent, their very essence reduced to a performance. And if the monks had subtly turned your silence into obedience, and the warriors had then honed your obedience into service, the astute merchants now skillfully transformed your service into a captivating spectacle for their patrons. They came for you when your village was on the brink of starvation. A man in fine sandals, holding a scroll, bearing a deceptive promise. He assured your father you would learn the arts of dance, song, and refinement, a guaranteed escape from the mud and gnawing hunger. And perhaps your father wept after he signed the binding contract, but only after the money had changed hands. For survival, in such desperate times, rarely appeared honorable.
You were merely 11 years old when they dressed you in fine silk and painted your young lips, plucked your brows with meticulous care, and powdered your skin to an unnatural pallor. During your rigorous training, you were strictly forbidden from seeing mirrors, for you were intended to become merely a surface upon which others projected their desires for beauty, never a being who recognized their own inherent worth. They taught you to move with the ethereal grace of the wind, quiet, responsive, and always adapting to the whims of your patrons. They instructed you to smile not with your mouth, but with your eyes, a subtle, inviting warmth. And most importantly, they taught you that any form of resistance would inevitably displease the customer, and an unhappy customer meant not only hunger, but something far, far worse.
They simply called you a Kajima, a shadow actor, emphasizing that you were not real, never truly real, only a meticulously crafted performance. The tea-houses themselves were immaculate, their sliding panels hand-painted with subtle erotic motifs, silk cushions arranged to perfectly draw the eye, and screens tilted to catch just enough lamplight to highlight your youth, your polished demeanor, and your subtly submissive curve. You knelt instinctively when guests arrived, bowing deeper than was truly necessary, pouring their drinks and refilling them without being asked, laughing politely at jokes that, in truth, deeply frightened you. Some customers desired lively conversation, others preferred absolute silence, and some shifted between both, leaving you utterly lost in the shifting sands of who you were pretending to be. They chose you with the detached scrutiny of men selecting fish from a market, examining your teeth, your skin, the precise way you knelt, how quickly you flushed with a touch. And you quickly learned to feign profound gratitude for their selection. Punishment here was chillingly efficient. You were not physically beaten, as in the temples, but rather you were billed. A customer complains, a day's wages instantly vanish. You show even a hint of fatigue, fines are levied for lack of energy. You speak too frankly, too honestly, another deduction is applied. Your very food, your bedding, the oil for the lamps, all are meticulously charged against your future.
The contract promised you freedom after repaying your initial cost, but that cost relentlessly accrued interest, the prices inexplicably rose, and the rules subtly changed, rendering freedom a cruel myth whispered between muffled sobs in the servants' quarters. One boy, desperate for escape, tried to run, making it only as far as the river before they dragged him back with ropes, paraded him shamefully through the quarter, and locked him in a desolate cell for an entire month with no bedding. When he finally emerged, he no longer resembled a boy, but rather the embodiment of crushing debt. Another boy chose a more quiet, elegant escape, taking poison, his face serene by morning, as if it were the first true sleep he had experienced in years, and he was replaced that very same afternoon without a moment's hesitation. Disease was tragically common here, as were infections and the pervasive, gnawing loneliness.
The doctors would never come to your aid, and the owners simply would not care, forcing you to learn to bandage your own wounds, to meticulously hide the blood, and to smile through agonizing ulcers, burning fevers, and skin that constantly itched with rot. An older, clever boy once taught you how to mix a special powder with wine to dull the relentless pain, but he too died quietly in his sleep, and they coldly labeled it laziness, docking his wages posthumously, with no one ever claiming his ashes.
But the most insidious torment was not inflicted upon the body. It was what they insidiously made you believe. They constantly told you that your beauty was a divine gift, that your suffering somehow gave others pleasure, that this pleasure was a sacred duty, and that duty, in its warped interpretation, was a form of love. Some boys, tragically, began to believe these twisted narratives, finding a perverse pride in how many men specifically requested them, how astronomically high their price climbed, and how much excruciating pain they could stoically endure without ever flinching. They transformed themselves into precisely what the house demanded, becoming perfect reflections of their patron's desires. And when these boys finally broke, they did so with a chilling quietude. No violent tantrums, no desperate cries for help. Just steps that grew progressively quieter, eyes that became duller and devoid of light, and breathing that grew shallower, almost imperceptible, a silent fading. Sometimes a curious foreigner would arrive, tall, pale, and often bewildered by the customs, speaking languages you could not understand, yet their faces were often easier to read. Some looking at you with profound pity, others with open revulsion, and still others with the same familiar hunger you had witnessed 100 times before. One peculiar British man, strange in his manners, once dared to ask your real name, and though you instinctively lied, for a brief, fleeting moment, you remembered it. And the memory itself caused a sharp, unexpected pain, because remembering meant knowing you had once been someone else entirely.
They called themselves the Mukokai, the Facing West Society, a name known to few, their purpose understood by even fewer, and fewer still lived long enough to witness the profound change they had begun. Yet they undeniably existed, quietly and patiently, in the unseen crevices of the sprawling empire where imperial oversight thinned and power no longer seemed so divinely absolute. They emerged wherever survivors gathered, not merely to endure their suffering, but to bravely remember it. And through that remembering, they slowly began to resist. The first among them were temple boys who had managed to escape during years of famine, when gods were far more preoccupied with rice riots than with missing novices. They had wandered, starving and deeply ashamed, until they found one another purely by accident, two boys huddled beneath a broken cart outside Kyoto, recognizing each other by the identical subtle scars etched upon their palms. Neither boy possessed a name any longer, so they bestowed new ones upon each other, and then together they gave each other an entirely new, shared purpose, a quiet resolve to reclaim what had been lost.
The early network of the Mukokai was loose and clandestine, its existence marked by codes scribbled subtly in the margins of ancient scrolls,
secret symbols delicately etched into obscure door frames, a certain precise way to bow that conveyed a hidden message, or a particular phrase spoken about the sea which always signified escape. Facing west became their silent motto, meaning to leave the oppressive old world irrevocably behind, to turn towards a new horizon. They daringly smuggled boys out of monasteries during the chaotic nights of festivals, hid them ingeniously within unsuspecting merchant caravans, meticulously falsified temple rosters, bribed complacent guards, and even replaced incriminating scrolls with innocuous ones. Some members skillfully posed as traveling physicians, inspecting wounds that, for them, told far more profound stories than any sutra ever could. Others bravely joined pleasure houses as unassuming servants, only to vanish weeks later with 3 young boys cleverly hidden in a cart filled with dirty linens, a quiet act of liberation. They never carried physical weapons. Their weapon was instead profound knowledge, their shield meticulous coordination, an intricate dance of information. They studied temple routines down to the minute, knew precisely which monks suffered from gout and thus could not chase, which stair creaked the loudest underfoot, which apprentice could be subtly bribed with a flask of wine, and which gates were left conveniently unlatched during the full moons. They meticulously mapped the predator's rhythm, weaving their audacious escapes between the very beats of his predictable pattern.
And always, relentlessly, they gathered stories, not to sensationalize or exploit the suffering, but to meticulously preserve the truth, because the most devastating lesson they had learnt was that if no one meticulously recorded what had been done, the pervasive system would simply pretend it had never happened at all. And silence, they now understood with chilling clarity, was not just a symptom, but the final, most insidious phase of abuse, the ultimate erasure. Yoshimaru was the first among them to bravely commit these truths to writing. He was 17 when they finally caught him, too old to be considered beautiful in their eyes, too quiet to be perceived as overtly dangerous. Yet in his profound quietude he had written, pages secretly hidden beneath floorboards, inked with the ash of candles and stolen brushes, pages that vividly described what transpired behind the sutra room, that meticulously listed names, that counted the brutal lashes, and that remembered with agonizing clarity the muffled screams. When his captors discovered some of these pages, they brutally broke his fingers, a cruel act of suppression. But they did not find all of them, because by then precious copies had already been passed to a young boy working in the temple kitchen, a boy who would bravely walk for 3 days straight to reach a silk merchant's shop in Sakai, a seemingly ordinary shop that sold fine cloth but also secretly stocked vital documents. Yoshimaru never wrote again, his hands forever marred, but countless others did, because he had shown them the way, proving that the truth once written could never truly be erased.
The Mukokai continued to grow, slowly, cautiously, expanding its network of resistance. They ingeniously created safe houses, cleverly disguised as innocuous calligraphy schools, as welcoming inns, or even as solemn funeral homes.
any place where questions were rarely asked and scrutiny was minimal. They painstakingly forged family records, allowing boys to become cousins to distant, unsuspecting farmers, seamlessly integrating them into new lives. They taught survivors invaluable trades: pottery, bookbinding, fishing, empowering them to earn a livelihood without ever again having to kneel in servitude. They shrewdly recruited former monks who had turned their backs on the temple, shamed and aged, but still profoundly fluent in the deceptive language of lies. These men then trained the resistance to recognize spiritual manipulation, to answer hollow sermons with an empowering silence, and to precisely identify grooming masked as benevolent guidance. Not all their vital work involved escape. Some brave individuals chose to stay behind, acting as covert spies and saboteurs. These were the boys who remained within the temples or pleasure houses just long enough to subtly plant incriminating letters, to discreetly infect food, or to whisper insidious doubts into the ears of others, sowing seeds of dissent. They called this strategy the slow unraveling, not a sudden explosive revolution, but a gradual, pervasive rot, a decay of ingrained obedience, a quiet corrosion of absolute certainty. If they could not bring down the entire oppressive structure at once, they could at least make its ancient creaking beams groan under the strain.
They lost many courageous souls along this perilous path. Some were tragically betrayed by boys too paralyzed by fear to rebel. Others were caught mid-run and publicly displayed as chilling warnings, and still others disappeared entirely, swallowed whole by the very system they had dared to challenge. But their names were meticulously remembered, carved into wood, subtly sewn into hymns, hidden within the verses of poems, and faithfully passed down through hushed whispers, because forgetting, they knew, was precisely how the suffering had been allowed to flourish in the first place. Eventually, against all odds, they found powerful allies. A samurai who had turned scribe, deeply ashamed of what he had once called loyalty. A Buddhist scholar whose own brother had tragically died within a temple's walls, and a shrewd court official who had quietly watched his own son returned from training with eyes that would never truly lift again. Together, these unlikely allies accomplished something no one had ever believed possible. They painstakingly wrote a petition, 27 names meticulously listed, 30 compelling pages detailing their truths, 3 intricate maps, and most powerfully, the signatures of 12 courageous survivors who had risked their very lives to speak. They carried this sacred document to Edo in the depths of winter, carefully wrapped in a lacquered scroll box, delivering it by hand to the highest authorities, and then they waited with bated breath.
The official response was predictably tepid. A perfunctory meeting, a bureaucratic committee formed, a formal declaration of deep concern, and some temples were superficially inspected. Some brothels issued mild warnings. But the system remarkably did not collapse. Instead, what truly collapsed was the pervasive certainty, the unquestioned authority it had always held. Because now,
The suffocating silence had been irrevocably pierced. Now, the supposedly sacred institutions were forced, for the first time, to explain themselves, to justify their existence. Now, those who dared to whisper resistance no longer sounded like madmen. They sounded, finally, like historians, like undeniable survivors, and most powerfully like truth itself. And that, they knew, was more than enough to truly begin. Because change, real, profound change, never truly starts with laws or decrees. It begins when the suffocating silence is no longer safe, when the young boy in the back of the temple stops bowing with both knees, a subtle act of rebellion. It starts when the kagema paints his lips with practiced grace, but deliberately leaves the customer waiting, asserting a quiet defiance. It begins when the ex-wakashu returns to the bustling pleasure district not to sell himself, but to bravely rescue others. It starts when the very bells that once rang over a world of imposed silence begin to sound not like markers of obedience, but like the solemn toll of mourning, like the haunting echo of memory, like a vital warning, and eventually like the gentle, burgeoning sound of hope itself.
They called it the Restoration Fellowship. Not a revolution or a new sect, but simply a quiet name that belied the extraordinary transformation it fostered. The survivors, against all expectations, did not vanish into the shadows, but instead they began to build. The very first meeting convened in an abandoned warehouse just outside Kyoto, a place of cold stone and flickering lamps, where 23 men, some barely more than boys, sat cross-legged in solemn rows, facing a broken altar. They bore no uniforms, for they needed none. What bound them together was not cloth or creed, but the shared weight of memory and the unwavering will to transmute that memory into protection for countless others. Yoshimaru was present, older now, his hands twisted and gnarled from the brutal beatings he had endured, and though he spoke without great volume, every man in the room leaned forward intently when he opened his mouth. "We were trained to obey," he said, his voice quiet but resonant, so thoroughly that our silence sounded like virtue. We will now train each other to disobey, to love, to speak, to fight. He continued, "The temples taught us that pain was sacred. Let us instead make joy sacred." They began with the most arduous task, fearlessly naming what had truly happened, without euphemisms or deceptive half-truths. They called it precisely what it was: exploitation, rape, control, and betrayal, stripping away all pretense.
And then, with unwavering resolve, they set to work, transforming their shared understanding into tangible action. They collectively purchased an old, dilapidated monastery with pooled coins and silent, anonymous donations, not with the intention of resuming worship, but rather to meticulously rebuild it from within, repurposing its very foundations. They stripped away the opulent statues and replaced the ornate tapestries with plain, unadorned cloth, signifying a rejection of past pretenses. They thoughtfully reopened the ancient kitchens, not for ritualistic offerings, but to provide nourishing meals for children who had nowhere else to eat, offering genuine sustenance. They bravely converted the once sacred prayer halls into vibrant classrooms, the cold, confining cells into warm communal dormitories, and the grim punishment rooms into serene, flourishing gardens, transforming spaces of suffering into places of growth and healing. The boys who once trembled in their ceremonial robes now eagerly learned carpentry, the gentle art of healing, and the expressive power of poetry. They delved into history, not the carefully curated version taught in the temple scrolls, but the authentic, often painful, real one, preserved in secret journals, etched into the backs of ink boxes, and whispered in the hushed safety of hidden houses. And most importantly, above all else, they learned the profound meaning of consent. No hand was ever laid without explicit permission, no gaze ever lingered without clear invitation, and every single child within their care knew unequivocally that their body was entirely their own, a sacred and inviolable truth.
The network of the Restoration Fellowship steadily grew, with survivors transforming into compassionate teachers, skilled craftsmen, insightful writers, and empathetic healers. They established nurturing homes for orphaned boys, opened vital clinics for the sick, founded welcoming bookshops that cleverly doubled as shelters, and cultivated peaceful farms where no one ever dared to question the scars etched upon her back. They meticulously trained former Kagema in the arts of tailoring and theatre, offering them a stage, this time on their own terms, to express their authentic selves. Former Wakashu became master swordsmen and knowledgeable herbalists. They taught the crucial skills of self-defense and the quiet inner strength that comes from resilience. Former Chigo courageously became monks once more, but only the kind who actively dismantled the old oppressive hierarchy from within, preaching sermons about the profound power of choice, not blind obedience. And some, choosing a quieter path, did nothing more than simply live their lives with gentle dignity. That, too, in its own way, was a profound victory, because mere survival was no longer the ultimate end of their story, but rather its powerful and hopeful beginning. In time, the fellowship began to gain significant influence. A prominent merchants' guild generously donated land. A distinguished Samarin family sent their own sons to be taught not how to kneel in submission, but how to truly listen with an open heart. Even the imperial court, in a remarkable gesture, dispatched a letter, sealed in red, respectfully asking for their counsel on the child matter. It was not full justice, for nothing ever truly is, but it was undeniable recognition, and recognition, for those who had been so profoundly silenced, was a sacred kind of resurrection.
They meticulously kept records, not to dwell in the past, but to remember, to protect the future from the insidious dangers of forgetting. In a lacquered archive at the very heart of their first training hall, they carefully stored the precious scrolls that had nearly cost them their lives, diaries, courageous court petitions, intricate coded messages, detailed floor plans of temples, and the names of countless victims alongside the names of their predators. This was not done to enact bitter revenge, but rather to ensure that one day a curious scholar or a frightened child would open a hidden box and learn a vital, comforting truth. You are not the first, and you are not alone.
Some days were filled with profound joy. Boys who had once been sold into a life of silence now stood confidently on stages, performing heartfelt poems about newfound freedom, or diligently planting trees beside the very rivers they had once only dared to dream of running toward. A former Chigo, against all odds, rose to become the respected governor of a province, a testament to his resilience. A Kagema, once a shadow actor, opened a vibrant theater where no role ever again required shame, celebrating authentic expression. And a Wakashu, once a Celibate, started a groundbreaking school where the ancient code of Bushido was rewritten to mean protect the weak, honor the vulnerable, and wield power only with explicit permission. They laughed loudly and uninhibitedly, something they had never dared to do within the confines of the temples. And when they cried, they did so surrounded by understanding hearts, never alone.
But there were still losses, for not everyone could truly forget the profound traumas they had endured. Some drank themselves into a quiet oblivion, unable to escape their past. Some disappeared into the vast, silent mountains, utterly unable to live in a world where children still suffered, even if less than before. They, too, were meticulously remembered. At the annual gathering held beneath the ancient ginkgo trees, their names were spoken aloud, each honored by the striking of a small resonant bell. No harsh incense, no chanting, just the pure, clear sound of memory. Yoshimaru himself passed away at the age of 61. He never married, never took a student, yet his hands, once brutally shattered, held the very first inkstone used by every new writer, trained in the fellowship's hallowed hall, a quiet legacy. His name remains carved beneath the entrance arch, a perpetual reminder, let the silence ring no more. By the early 13th century, the temples across the land had undeniably changed, some out of pure fear, some out of profound shame, and some because their newest monks had been quietly trained by the very fellowship they once sought to suppress. There were still shadows lurking, to be sure, but now there were undeniably more lights, more beacons of hope. And the bells, the very bells that once mocked curfew and punishment and unspoken dread, now marked entirely different things. Lessons beginning, nourishing meal served, joyous laughter, and the sweet, resonant sound of freedom. The world did not become perfectly utopian, but it became profoundly possible.
Because a boy once knelt on a cold stone floor, trembling with silent fear, his head shorn to please a man who falsely claimed God demanded it, and then, somehow, against all odds, he rose. And because he rose, countless others rose with him, a quiet, powerful wave of resistance. And because they rose, the ancient temples, though they did not fall, were irrevocably forced to change, to adapt to a new era of truth and accountability. And because they changed, the very next boy who entered their imposing gates was not taught to fear the sound of footsteps behind him, anticipating danger. Instead, he was taught fundamentally to speak, to find his own voice, to assert his own truth.
And he did. And the bells of Japan continued to ring on, not over a world of imposed silence, but over a world filled with the vibrant, resounding sound of voice, a powerful chorus of freedom. And no one ever again would mistake the two for each other, for the distinction between silence and voice had been made clear, a lasting legacy of courage and profound change.
Now, as the echoes of this ancient tale fade, may your own spirit find peace and your dreams be filled with the quiet strength of resilience, guiding you gently into a restful sleep.